The United States-Mexico border, stretching over 1,900 miles, is more than just a line on a map. It has been the site of wars, treaties, territorial disputes, migration crises, and national identity struggles. This isn't just about a fence or a wall. It has a story rooted in colonial legacies, expansionism, revolution, and human resilience. Today, we'll dive deep into the long and turbulent history of the border conflict between the United States and Mexico, from the early 1800s to the 21st century. The Spanish Empire and early settlements. Long before the United States existed, the lands that make up the present-day American Southwest belonged to indigenous nations and were later colonized by Spain. Mexico, after gaining independence from Spain in 1821, inherited these vast northern territories, including Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico. American expansionism, meanwhile, in the early 1800s, the newly formed United States was expanding westward. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand coast to coast, drove settlers and political leaders to push into territories claimed by Mexico. The rise of American settlers in Mexican Texas in the 1820s, Mexico encouraged American settlers to move into Texas to develop the region. Soon, however, the Anglo-American population in Texas grew larger than the Tejano population. Tensions rose due to cultural differences, especially regarding slavery, which was illegal in Mexico, but practiced by American settlers. The Texas Rebellion. In 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico. The Mexican government, led by General Santa Anna, tried to crush the rebellion, but was defeated at the Battle of San Jacinto. The newly formed Republic of Texas remained independent for nearly a decade, though Mexico never recognized its independence. The U.S. annexes Texas. In 1845, the United States officially annexed Texas. This infuriated Mexico, which still claimed Texas as its own. Diplomatic relations broke down, and war loomed. Prelude to war. The dispute over the Texas border, whether it ended at the Nueces River or the Rio Grande, sparked violence. In April 1846, skirmishes broke out between Mexican and American forces. President James K. Polk used the incident to justify war. A war of invasion, the Mexican-American War was brutal. The U.S. invaded from multiple directions. General Zachary Taylor led troops from the north, while General Winfield Scott captured Veracruz and marched on Mexico City. The U.S. Navy blockaded Mexican ports, and American forces took control of California and New Mexico. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In 1848, the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico ceded nearly half its territory to the U.S., including California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other states. In return, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million. Legacy of loss for Mexico. It was a national trauma, a deep loss of land and pride. For the U.S., it marked a dramatic expansion of territory, but also intensified the debate over slavery and led to new conflicts with indigenous nations. In 1854, the U.S. purchased additional land from Mexico, now southern Arizona and New Mexico, in what became known as the Gadsden Purchase. The goal was to secure land for a southern transcontinental railroad. This purchase finalized the current U.S.-Mexico boundary, but tensions remained high for decades. Apache Wars and cross-border raids. Throughout the late 1800s, the border region was plagued by violence. Apache groups, resisting American and Mexican expansion, moved back and forth across the border. U.S. and Mexican forces struggled to control the area. The Mexican Revolution. During the Mexican Revolution, instability spilled over into the U.S. Pancho Villa. A revolutionary general even raided Columbus, New Mexico, in 1916. In response, the U.S. sent General John J. Pershing in a failed attempt to capture Villa. a campaign that only increased tensions. The rise of Border Patrol in the early 20th century, the UC began to regulate immigration more strictly. In 1924, the U.S. Border Patrol was established primarily to control entry from Mexico. This marked the beginning of the militarized border as we know it today. Labor migration and the Bracero program. Despite border restrictions, the U.S. relied heavily on Mexican labor. The Bracero program brought millions of Mexican laborers to work in U.S. farms and railroads. This created a dependency on cross-border labor, even as anti-immigrant sentiment grew. The rise of the cartels. In the late 20th century, drug cartels in Mexico began using the U.S. border to smuggle narcotics northward. This triggered intense anti-drug campaigns, with billions spent on interdiction, fences, and surveillance. Operation Gatekeeper and border militarization. In 1994, Operation Gatekeeper began fortifying parts of the border near San Diego. As enforcement increased in urban areas, migrants and smugglers were pushed into dangerous desert regions, leading to thousands of deaths over the decades. Why people cross? Many migrants cross the U.S.-Mexico border to flee violence, poverty, or political instability. Some seek asylum, others seek work. But the journey is often treacherous, involving smugglers, dehydration, injury, or arrest. Children and family separation. In recent years, the U.S. border has become the site of humanitarian crises, especially involving children. Policies that led to family separation under the zero-tolerance approach during the Trump administration drew widespread criticism. Building the wall. The idea of a border wall became a central political issue in the 21st century. While barriers had existed for decades, President Donald Trump's 2016 campaign promise to build the wall turned the border into a symbol of national security, sovereignty, and division. Environmental and social impacts. The construction of border walls disrupted wildlife migration, indigenous lands, and local communities. Critics argue that it does little to stop smuggling or migration, while supporters see it as necessary for national defense. The border today, the U.S.-Mexico border, is a complex zone of trade, culture, family, and politics. Every day, millions of people cross legally for work, school, or commerce. Border cities like Tijuana, San Diego, and El Paso, Ciudad Juarez represent unique binational ecosystems. Immigration reform stalemate. Despite decades of debate, Congress has struggled to pass meaningful immigration reform. DACA, asylum policy, Title 42, and deportations remain political flashpoints, often leaving lives in limbo. Shared interests. The U.S. and Mexico are deeply interconnected, economically, socially, and environmentally. Trade through NAFTA, shared environmental concerns, and cross-border families highlight mutual dependence. Rethinking the border. Some advocate for a more humane, cooperative approach, investing in Latin American development, streamlining legal immigration, and focusing on root causes of migration rather than walls and enforcement. The U.S.-Mexico border tells the story of two nations forever linked by conflict, culture, commerce, and human struggle. It is a place where ancient history and modern politics collide. The border is not just a wall, it is a living, breathing line where lives unfold, laws are challenged, and identities are shaped. Understanding its past may be the only way to forge a more peaceful future. To fully understand the border conflict, we must turn to the people who live along it. In El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, thousands of families share cross-border lives. Grandparents live on one side, children on the other. Many people commute daily, for school, for work, for healthcare. But policies like passport restrictions, visa delays, and border closures during COVID-19 disrupted these rhythms of life. One woman, Letitia, shared how after her husband was deported, their children lived divided, the eldest in the U.S., the youngest in Mexico. They used to meet at the Paso del Norte Bridge, just to see each other for a few hours a week. In Nogal, the border wall cuts directly through neighborhoods, slicing a once-connected community in half. Local residents remember playing soccer across the fence in the 1980s now. Surveillance towers and patrols make even speaking across the border feel dangerous. The human toll is not just physical. It's emotional, psychological, spiritual. These borderlands, for many, are homelands. The North American Free Trade Agreement, signed in 1994, reshaped the U.S.-Mexico border. More than perhaps any policy since the Mexican-American War, the agreement created a tri-national trade bloc among the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. For border towns, it transformed economies. In Mexico, maquiladoras, foreign-owned factories, sprang up along the border, producing everything from auto parts to electronics for American companies. This brought jobs, but also low wages, poor labor protections, and environmental damage. On the U.S. side, logistics, shipping, and customs industries boomed. Cities like Laredo, Texas, once quiet river towns, became major ports of entry for goods. But the downside was clear. While goods flowed freely, people did not. The economic integration created demand for labor, but the U.S. restricted legal immigration. This disconnect fueled undocumented migration, a problem rooted not in lawlessness, but in economic policy. Today, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement has replaced NAFTA with added labor and environmental provisions. Yet the same patterns continue: growth for some, inequality for others. In the 2010s and early 2020s, the border became a flashpoint for international crises, especially around asylum seekers. Under U.S. and international law, anyone can seek asylum if they face persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. But the application process is slow and often arbitrary. Many migrants come from Central America, especially the Northern Triangle countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, fleeing gang violence, political instability, and extreme poverty. In 2018 and 2019, migrant caravans, large groups of families traveling on foot, approached the border. Some Americans feared an invasion. Others saw people in need. The media spectacle polarized public opinion. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. implemented Title 42, a health policy that effectively closed the border to asylum seekers. Thousands were expelled without hearings. Tent camps sprang up on the Mexican side, often in dangerous conditions. Asylum law became a battlefield, not just for legality, but morality. Where there's restriction, there's opportunity for exploitation. Coyotes, human smugglers, charge migrants thousands of dollars for a chance to cross the border. Some are part of criminal syndicates. Others are poor locals trying to earn money. The journey is often treacherous. Migrants may be robbed, assaulted, kidnapped, or abandoned in the desert. Corruption exists on both sides. Some U.S. Border Patrol agents have been caught accepting bribes. Some Mexican officials work with smugglers or cartels. In border towns, law enforcement is often underfunded, making bribery and organized crime hard to combat. The underground economy thrives on desperation and grows stronger when legal pathways are closed. Why do borders evoke such strong feelings? For some, borders represent safety, control, sovereignty. For others, they represent division, exclusion, fear. Psychologically, borders become symbols, not just of geography, but of identity. In the U.S., debates about the Mexico border often reflect fears of losing culture or being overwhelmed by outsiders. Politicians invoke the border to stir up nationalism, but studies show that immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens, and that multicultural regions often thrive economically and creatively. The question becomes, is the border a barrier or a bridge? Certain photographs and videos have seared the border conflict into the global conscience. In 2019, an image of a father and daughter, Asker and Valeria, lying face down in the Rio Grande after drowning while trying to cross, broke hearts worldwide. In 2018, photos of children in cages under aluminum blankets in U.S. detention centers sparked outrage. In 2021, a video of Border Patrol agents on horseback chasing Haitian migrants at the Del Rio crossing stirred comparisons to slave patrols. These moments forced the world to look and to ask, who are we as a society when we treat human lives as problems instead of people? The border is not just a U.S. issue, it's a binational one. In the U.S., border policy swings dramatically depending on which party is in power. Democrats have focused on pathways to citizenship and humanitarian aid. Republicans often emphasize security, enforcement, and deterrence. In Mexico, presidents have also shifted. Some, like Andrés Manuel López Obrador, have tried to balance diplomacy with domestic priorities. Under pressure from the U.S., Mexico has deployed its National Guard to stop migrants from traveling north, effectively enforcing U.S. policy on Mexican soil. The power imbalance is clear. The U.S. sets the tone, Mexico responds. But both nations must collaborate, or the crisis continues. Long before any modern border existed, indigenous peoples lived freely across this land. The border split many of these nations: the Tohono O'odham, the Yaqui, the Kickapoo. For the Tohono O'odham, whose traditional territory spans Arizona and Sonora, the wall has blocked sacred pilgrimage routes, burials, and even access to water. Indigenous leaders have resisted, filing lawsuits and organizing protests. They argue the border wall violates treaties and spiritual rights. Yet construction has often continued without consultation or consent. In truth, the border is a colonial invention, superimposed on ancient lands. What could a better border look like? Scholars, activists, and planners have imagined alternatives. Binational economic zones, where people live and work across the border with shared governance. Humanitarian visas for safe, legal migration. Environmental corridors to preserve wildlife across nations. Tech-driven ports of entry that ease congestion and reduce smuggling. But change requires political will and empathy. A future of peace and cooperation is possible, but it demands that we see the border not just as a wall, but as a wound that can heal. The U.S.-Mexico border is many things: a line, a symbol, a scar. It has been drawn in blood and law, culture and sand. It holds the weight of centuries, conquest and resistance, hope and heartbreak. For some, it is a dream. For others, a barrier. But always it is real. It shapes lives every single day. The question is not just how we guard it, but how we understand it. Because the border is not just there, on a map. It lives inside us, in the choices we make, the values we hold, and the stories we tell. Let us tell those stories with dignity. Let us build not just walls, but wisdom. The border isn't just a line. It's an inspiration, a canvas, a metaphor. From the folk ballads of corridos to the murals in Chicano neighborhoods, from Hollywood films to underground signs, the U.S.-Mexico border has given birth to a rich cultural dialogue that transcends politics and patrols. In music, artists like Los Tigres del Norte have told stories of migration, family separation, and longing in ways that resonate across generations. Their songs humanize the journey, the risks, the dreams, the heartbreak. In cinema, films like El Norte, Sin Nombre, and Babel depict the peril and desperation of crossing, as well as the resilience and hope that accompany it. Even mainstream Hollywood has weighed in, with films like Sicario and Traffic portraying the drug war's brutality, though often through a U.S.-centric lens. In visual art, the border wall itself has become a site for protest and creativity. Painted, pierced, reimagined. Some artists have projected light across both sides. Others have installed seesaws between the slats, letting children from both countries play together for a few precious moments. The border may divide, but art reminds us of our shared humanity. Beyond human conflict, the border also affects ecosystems. The U.S.-Mexico border spans deserts, rivers, mountains, and plains. It's home to endangered species like the jaguar, Mexican gray wolf, and Sonoran pronghorn. But fences, walls, and lighting disrupt animal migration patterns and fragment habitats. In some places, concrete and steel walls cut through national wildlife refuges, tribal lands, and protected areas. Flash flooding has worsened in walled-off areas where natural water drainage is blocked. Biologists and conservationists warn that the border wall acts like a biological dam, not just stopping people, but nature itself. Collaborative binational conservation programs have shown promise, but they struggle to compete with militarization and wall construction, which often proceed under emergency waivers that bypass environmental law. The border's future, it seems, will also shape the future of biodiversity. To truly understand the border, we must listen. On the U.S. side, Miguel, a third-generation Texan, says, "The border is home. It's family. I don't see it as us and them. It's just ... us." Brenda, a Border Patrol agent, reflects, "I've pulled kids out of the desert who were near death. But I've also arrested the same smuggler 6 times. It's a hard job. There's no easy answers." On the Mexican side, Rosa, a migrant shelter worker in Tijuana, "We feed everyone. We give blankets, diapers, shoes. We're just trying to give people dignity. They've lost everything else." Carlos, a teenager from Honduras waiting for asylum, "They call us invaders, but I didn't want to leave. I was threatened with death. What would you do?" These voices are not statistics. They are lives caught between nations, between hope and hardship. Over the decades, the courts have played a powerful role in defining what the U.S.-Mexico border means. Hernandez v. Mesa, a Mexican teenager, Sergio Hernandez, was shot and killed by a U.S. Border Patrol agent while standing on the Mexican side of the border. The family sued in U.S. courts, but the Supreme Court ruled they had no constitutional protection because Sergio wasn't a U.S. citizen and was on foreign soil. Critics called it a dangerous precedent, granting immunity for cross-border killings. Elio v. DHS. The ACLU and other civil rights groups have repeatedly sued over family separation, arguing that the policy violated due process and international law. Several lower courts have ruled in favor of migrants, awarding damages or ordering reunifications. But systemic change remains slow, tangled in bureaucracy, partisanship, and public opinion. The law, like the border, remains in flux. The U.S.-Mexico border is not just a domestic issue. It's part of a global conversation about migration, sovereignty, and human rights. From the United Nations to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, international bodies have condemned certain U.S. policies, especially family separation, prolonged detention, and the treatment of asylum seekers. Countries like Canada and many in Europe have watched closely, debating how to balance security and compassion in their own borders. Some cite the U.S. approach as a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, migrant crises in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia mirror many of the same dilemmas. Who gets in? Who decides? How do nations honor their values while protecting their borders? In this sense, the U.S.-Mexico border is a microcosm, a reflection of 21st century global migration ethics. Some argue the future of the border isn't a wall, it's a network. Biometric scanning, drones and surveillance towers, AI-powered movement detection, facial recognition at ports of entry, databases that track migrants in real time. Supporters call it the smart border, efficient, less intrusive, more accurate. Critics call it a surveillance nightmare, prone to abuse, racial profiling, and privacy violations. In 2023, Congress debated new funding for non-physical infrastructure, emphasizing virtual walls over concrete ones. But many migrants now face invisible barriers, denied entry by algorithms rather than guards. The border may become harder to see, but no less real. As nations look to the future, some ask, what does justice look like? Should the U.S. formally apologize for the Mexican-American War or the seizure of lands? Should there be reparations for families split by deportation or children lost in custody? In California, Chicano studies programs push for historical reckoning. In Texas, indigenous groups call for the return of ancestral lands. In Mexico, activists demand dignity for migrants and sovereignty in U.S. foreign policy. In both countries, border resistance movements are growing, using art, protests, and education to challenge dominant narratives. History is not just remembered. It's reinterpreted and sometimes rewritten. In the end, the border is many things. It is real and symbolic, political and personal, ancient and modern, violent and beautiful. It is a place of contradictions, of trauma and transformation, of endings and new beginnings. And while the wall may stand tall in steel and concrete, it cannot divide what truly binds us, the unshakable truth that we are all human, seeking safety, purpose, and belonging. As long as borders exist, so too will the stories that cross them. The U.S.-Mexico border isn't just a political line, it's a public health frontier. In cities like El Paso, McAllen, and San Diego, binational healthcare networks form a lifeline. Thousands of U.S. residents, especially the uninsured, cross into Mexico daily for cheaper medication, dental care, and surgery. But on the humanitarian side, the situation is starkly different. Migrants arriving at the border, many after weeks of exposure, hunger, and trauma, often require urgent medical care. NGOs and volunteers step in where government infrastructure fails. In overcrowded detention facilities, disease spreads rapidly. Flu, scabies, COVID-19. Mental health crises are common among children who've been separated from their families or detained for weeks. Doctors Without Borders and other health organizations have called the border a medical emergency zone. And yet, few long-term solutions exist. The health of those caught at the border is often neglected until it's too late. Women and children face unique dangers along the border. For women, the journey north is perilous. Studies estimate that 60 to 80% of female migrants from Central America experience sexual assault en route, often by traffickers, smugglers, or corrupt officials. Some take birth control before traveling, expecting to be raped. Many are fleeing gender-based violence, domestic abuse, femicide, forced marriage, only to face new threats at the U.S. border. Children fare no better. Separated from their parents under zero-tolerance policies, many were housed in bleak detention centers, some never reunited with family. Even today, unaccompanied minors wait in legal limbo. Some face court hearings without lawyers. Others are deported alone to countries they can't even remember. At the border, the most vulnerable pay the highest price. Education doesn't stop at the border. It adapts. In places like San Isidro and El Paso, schools cater to children who cross the border daily. Transfronterizo students, many U.S. citizens living in Mexico, wait before dawn to commute across international lines, often waiting hours in line just to make it to class. These children live binational lives, Mexican at home, American at school. Their identities are layered, complex, often misunderstood. Meanwhile, in detention centers, education is minimal. Advocates push for access to teachers, books, and emotional support for migrant children in custody. Some children report being held for weeks or months without schooling. And in deportation, education becomes collateral damage. Children sent back to unstable regions often lose years of schooling, sometimes permanently. The classroom becomes one more space shaped by border policy. If you want to see the future of migration, look at the climate. In Central America, droughts are killing crops. Floods are destroying homes. Hurricanes grow more violent each year. Families who once farmed their land for generations now find it unlivable. Climate change is creating a new class of refugee, the climate migrant, people displaced not by war, but by weather. Already, many of the migrants arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border are fleeing environmental collapse. But the legal system doesn't recognize climate refugees. There's no official protection under U.S. asylum law for those displaced by drought or disaster. This legal gap means the border will continue to see more desperation and fewer solutions. Thousands have died trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border. Their bodies lie in deserts, rivers, mass graves, and unidentified morgues. Since the 1990s, over 8,000 deaths have been documented, and likely many more unrecorded. In the Arizona desert, activists leave water jugs and rescue beacons. In Texas, forensic anthropologists work to identify anonymous bones found on ranches. In California, families place crosses along highways in memory of lost loved ones. Art projects like the Hostile Terrain 94 exhibit map these deaths with toe tags pinned to border maps, each one a life lost to policy. But the dead are not just numbers. They are parents, children, dreamers, and their memory demands more than silence. It demands change. In many ways, the U.S.-Mexico border is a mirror, reflecting our values, fears, and contradictions. It reflects American fears of invasion, but also our reliance on migrant labor. It reflects Mexican frustrations with inequality, but also hopes for opportunity. It reflects racial tension, economic exploitation, and geopolitical strategy, all in one thin strip of sand and steel. Every time we debate the border, we're really debating ourselves. Who belongs? Who decides? What kind of country and world do we want to be? The wall may rise, but so do the questions. Narrator, and so we come to the end, not of a story, but of a journey. The U.S.-Mexico border is not a single event, but an evolving chapter in the story of North America. It is about conquest and colonization, migration and resilience, fear and compassion, power and people. We cannot undo the past, but we can learn from it. We cannot remove the wall overnight, but we can look over it, speak through it, love beyond it. The border may divide land, but it cannot divide the soul. Let us remember that behind every statistic is a story. Behind every policy is a person. And beyond every border is another human being, just like us. This is the border. This is its story. And now it's ours to carry forward. Throughout history, the U.S.-Mexico border has been used not just as a security zone, but as a political tool. Every election cycle, the border resurfaces in campaign speeches, media headlines, and social media storms. It is portrayed alternately as a war zone, a humanitarian crisis, or a symbol of strength. Rarely is it shown as a living region with real communities. The migrant caravan narrative, for example, is often used to stoke fear, even when data shows that illegal border crossings have dropped, or that migrants are primarily families and asylum seekers, not criminals or drug traffickers. This fear narrative benefits politicians on all sides. It distracts from broader policy failures, and it mobilizes voters through emotional triggers rather than informed discussion. Fear sells, and the border, for many, has become a business of fear. For indigenous communities, a U.S.-Mexico border is more than a boundary. It's a wound that never healed. Before colonialism, nations like the Tohono O'odham Kickapoo, Yaqui, Apache, and Kumeyaay lived across what would become an international line. That line was imposed without their consent, slicing through territories, families, and ceremonial spaces. Tohono O'odham elders speak of burial grounds now fenced off, of being denied entry to their own lands during ceremonies. Some are U.S. citizens, others Mexican nationals, but their culture is binational, their identity unconfined. When construction of the border wall accelerated, sacred sites were dynamited, water routes were blocked, wildlife corridors were destroyed, all without tribal consultation. Indigenous voices have led legal battles and held prayer walks across the desert, not to make a political point, but to protect what remains of their sovereignty. For them, the border is not just unjust, it is an erasure. In the name of national security, militarization has reshaped life along the border. Border Patrol has grown into one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the U.S. Its agents are allowed to operate within 100 miles of any international border, encompassing entire cities like San Diego, Tucson, El Paso, and even parts of Florida and Michigan. This gives them power to search vehicles, board buses, and detain individuals without a warrant, powers many say violate civil liberties. Military-style checkpoints dot the highways. Surveillance drones buzz overhead. Humvees and a TVSP, towns that once thrived on binational exchange. In some communities, this constant enforcement creates a climate of fear and mistrust. American citizens with brown skin report being harassed or profiled. Immigrants, documented or not, live in a state of quiet panic. The promise of safety has come at the cost of community trust. If the 20th century border was defined by fences, the 21st century border is defined by code, facial recognition cameras, AI motion sensors, social media monitoring, biometric tracking, predictive analytics. The Department of Homeland Security and U.S. Customs and Border Protection now operate one of the most expansive surveillance networks in the Western Hemisphere. But the tech doesn't always work, and it rarely comes with oversight. In 2021, a major data breach revealed that CBP facial recognition images had been hacked. Advocacy groups warn that this surveillance infrastructure could be used beyond the border, turning ordinary cities into monitored zones. Meanwhile, migrants are now digitally profiled, flagged by algorithms long before they reach the border. Privacy is eroded, not just by patrols, but by programs invisible to the naked eye. The new wall is not steel, it's silicone. Narrator: the border is not just a place. It is a poem written in sand, rewritten by wind, and stamped with boots. It is a lullaby whispered in two tongues, a cry from the desert and a hymn from the hills. It is a father's empty bed, a mother's promise, a child's drawing of home. It is the sound of helicopters above, of coyotes howling in the dusk, of mariachis playing across steel slats on Sunday mornings. It is the silence between flags, the breath between checkpoints, the pause between a question and an answer that never comes. And still it endures. For every wall built, a bridge waits. For every checkpoint, a hand reaches. For every policy, a person dreams. For every border drawn, another human heart crosses freely. This is not just the story of a boundary. It is the story of us all. In the shadows of fences and floodlights, faith communities have become lifelines. Churches on both sides of the border, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, and interfaith, provide shelter, food, medical care, and legal aid to migrants. Many pastors describe it not as activism, but as duty. In Nogal, the Kino Border Initiative, led by Jesuit priests and nuns, runs a shelter where families deported from the U.S. receive warmth, clothes, and counsel. In McAllen, Texas, Sacred Heart Church opens its doors to buses of weary asylum seekers every single day. Faith isn't just practiced, it's tested. Some churches have become sanctuary churches, sheltering undocumented migrants from deportation despite legal risks. On the other side, religious rhetoric is also used to justify strict immigration policies. Politicians quote scripture to support border enforcement. Religion, like the border, divides and unites. But in its truest form, faith at the border means compassion without conditions. Where policy divides, sports sometimes heal. In El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, young athletes form cross-border soccer leagues, practicing in Mexico, competing in the U.S., and growing up between languages, coaches, and flags. Every year, the Binational Baseball Classic brings together teams from Texas and northern Mexico, a rare celebration of what binds the region, not what splits it. These sporting events, often informal and community-run, are more than games. They're acts of resistance against a narrative that says cooperation is impossible. Cultural festivals, Dia de los Muertos parades, mariachi concerts, and food fairs similarly defy the idea that the border is only a barrier. In towns like Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, and Calexico, Mexicali, these events serve as reminders. People were neighbors before they were foreigners. Even border walls themselves have hosted art installations, live music, and bilingual poetry readings, transforming steel into story. Though often portrayed as impoverished or chaotic, the border region is also a cradle of innovation. In Tijuana, young entrepreneurs are turning old factories into tech incubators. In El Paso, artists and engineers are collaborating on sustainable design. Medical researchers from both sides work on joint projects to fight diseases endemic to the region, like tuberculosis and diabetes. The U.S.-Mexico Border Health Commission, established in 2000, facilitates cross-border healthcare collaboration. Universities in San Diego and Mexicali share students and labs. Even in security, innovation has emerged not just in surveillance, but in non-lethal border monitoring, humanitarian tech, and rescue drones that find lost migrants in the desert. The border is not only a place of conflict, it is a place of invention, a frontier in every sense of the word. What would it take to truly fix the border? Immigration experts, historians, indigenous leaders, economists, and migrants themselves have all proposed ideas, some radical, some modest, but all aimed at creating a more just, humane system. Here are just a few. Pathways to legal work without permanent citizenship, to meet labor demands and reduce undocumented crossings. Mobile processing units that reduce bottlenecks and wait times at asylum checkpoints. Restorative justice for families separated under past policies, including reunification support and trauma counseling. Recognition of climate refugees under asylum law. Demilitarization zones and community policing rather than federal overreach. Binational town councils for shared governance in cities that straddle the border. And most critically, listening to the people most affected. Reform is possible, but it must begin with courage and compassion as policy. This story is long, tangled, and often painful. It spans centuries. It traverses empires and ends in backyards. It unfolds in courtrooms, detention centers, shrines, and mass graves. But there's one place where the border lives most clearly: memory. The memory of a child clutching a parent's hand at a checkpoint. The memory of a field medic resuscitating a dehydrated boy in the Sonoran Desert. The memory of a rancher whose backyard became a graveyard. The memory of a nun praying over the lifeless body of a teen lost in the brush. The memory of a judge haunted by the tears of a woman he had to deport. The memory of a people still waiting for their land to be respected. The memory of a nation divided not by soil, but by soul. We cannot erase the border, but we can remember its weight. And in remembering, we can begin to heal. In the end, the border is not just a place on a map. It's a story, a test, a wound, a bridge. It's the line we draw, and the line we must dare to cross. We can choose fear, or we can choose vision. We can choose walls, or we can choose wisdom. We can choose silence, or we can choose to speak. Because borders do not define humanity. Humanity defines the border. And the pen is still in our hands.